The moment my brother-in-law pulled out that folder in the middle of the mediation room, I watched my sister's lawyer lean back in her chair like she'd already won. She hadn't. My name is Sylvia, I'm 38 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that keeping the peace was the same thing as being loved. I believed that if I stayed quiet, stayed useful, stayed small, my family would eventually see me. I was wrong about all of it. But it took a conference room in downtown Calgary, a real estate portfolio worth just under $4 million, and my brother-in-law's expression going completely blank for me to finally understand that. Let me take you back to where it started. My mother died in February. Not the dramatic kind of death people write stories about. She went quietly, in the palliative care unit at Foothills Medical Center, on a Tuesday morning while I was sitting next to her holding a paper cup of cold Tim Hortons coffee. She had been sick for 2 years. We knew it was coming. That didn't make the Tuesday any easier. What I didn't know was that she had changed her will 6 weeks before she died. My mother had 2 daughters, me and my younger sister Rachel. Growing up, Rachel was the one who got the new figure skates every season, the one who got the car at 16, the one whose university tuition was paid without a second thought. I worked through school. I waitressed at a family restaurant on 17th Avenue through my undergrad, took out student loans, graduated with a degree in business administration and $34,000 in debt. I didn't resent it, not really. I understood that I was older, that circumstances had been tighter when I was young, that my parents had simply had more by the time Rachel came around. What I could never quite swallow was how invisible it made me feel. My mother had a house in Tuscany Hills, a detached in a quiet cul-de-sac, bought in 2003 for $212,000. By the time she passed, that same property was assessed at just over $800,000. She also had RRSPs, a TFSA, and a small commercial property in Red Deer that she and my late father had purchased together in the early 90s, and that had been generating rental income for decades. I had assumed, since my mother and I had never discussed the details, that things would be split evenly. Maybe not perfectly. Maybe Rachel would get the house since she still lived in Calgary, and I'd get the investment accounts. I had moved to Vancouver Island 12 years ago, built a life there. I didn't need the house, I just expected something fair. Instead, I got a phone call from my mother's estate lawyer 3 weeks after the funeral. He was kind about it. He said my mother's final will, signed in December, left the house and the Red Deer property entirely to Rachel. The RRSP beneficiary designation, which my mother had also updated, named Rachel as sole beneficiary, the TFSA. I was left a specific bequest, my mother's pearl earrings, a small oil painting she'd loved, and $25,000. Out of an estate worth approximately $2.3 million after liabilities, I received $25,000 and some jewelry. I sat in my kitchen in Nanaimo for a long time after I hung up. I didn't cry. I just sat there with my hands flat on the table, listening to the rain on the roof, thinking about the Tuesday morning with the cold coffee and how I had held her hand while she slept, and how none of that had changed anything. Rachel called me 4 days later. I almost didn't pick up. "I want you to know," she said, "that Mom made her choices and I'm going to respect them." I said, "Okay. I just think it would have been hard for you to manage property from the island anyway." I said, "Okay," again. There was a pause. Then she said, "You're not going to make this difficult, are you, Syl?" And something in me, something that had been compressing quietly for 38 years, went very, very still. I said, "I'll talk to you soon, Rachel," and I hung up. Here is what my sister and her husband, a man named Clifton, did not know. I had spent the 12 years I lived on Vancouver Island, building a property management company. What started as me buying a single duplex in Lanceville with money I'd saved and a CMHC-insured mortgage had, by the time my mother died, become a portfolio of 11 properties across the island and the lower mainland. I had a holding company. I had investors. I had a property management arm that managed over 60 units for third-party owners. I understood real estate law, mortgage structures, tenancy agreements, and asset valuation in ways that most people who grew up in my family never imagined I might. I also understood, once I spent 2 evenings reading through my mother's will and the relevant sections of the Alberta Wills and Succession Act, that I had grounds to challenge it. Not because I was greedy, because something didn't add up. My mother had made her previous will in 2019. In that version, which I obtained a copy of through my own lawyer, the estate had been divided equally between Rachel and me, with the house going to Rachel at appraised value with a corresponding cash payment to me to equalize. That was the plan she'd had for years. What changed in December? My lawyer, a woman in Victoria who had handled all my real estate transactions and knew me well, walked me through it carefully. She said the December will was valid on its face, properly witnessed, properly signed. But she also noted that my mother had been on significant medication by that point, that her cognitive status in the final weeks of her life had been a documented concern in her medical file, and that the changes were dramatic enough to raise a question of testamentary capacity. She also noted something else. The witnesses on the December will were Clifton's coworker and Clifton's cousin. I want to be clear about what I felt at that point. It wasn't rage. It was something colder and quieter than rage, a kind of absolute clarity. The kind you get when you've been telling yourself a comfortable story for years and you finally just stop. I instructed my lawyer to initiate a challenge. Rachel's response was immediate and, I think, revealing. Within a week of receiving the legal notice, she and Clifton had retained their own lawyer, a partner at a mid-sized firm in Calgary that specialized in estates litigation, and Clifton had begun calling me directly, bypassing our lawyers entirely. The first call, he was reasonable. He said this was a family matter and should be resolved as a family. I said I agreed and that my lawyer would be in touch. The second call, he was less reasonable. He said I was being vindictive. He said my mother had made a clear and conscious decision. He said I had always been difficult. The third call, I didn't answer. What I did instead was begin pulling documents. I requested my mother's medical records through the proper channels. I had my lawyer subpoena the financial records connected to the estate. And I started asking careful questions of the people who had been around my mother in her final weeks. Her neighbor, a woman named Helen who had been her friend for 20 years and who had sat with her often during those last months. Helen had things to tell me. She told me that Clifton had visited my mother frequently in November and December, more than he ever had before. She told me that Rachel had been handling all of my mother's financial paperwork since October, including her online banking access. She told me that my mother had asked her once in early December if she thought it was wrong to want everyone to be happy. Helen didn't know what my mother meant at the time. I thought I understood it now. The mediation was scheduled for a Thursday in March, about 5 weeks after the legal challenge was filed. I flew to Calgary the night before and stayed at a hotel near the airport. I didn't sleep particularly well. I lay in the dark and ran through everything I knew. The timeline, the documents, the testimony Helen had agreed to provide, and I thought about my mother's hands, which had been very small and very cold by the end. I got up at 5:30, made coffee with the room's little machine, and sat by the window while the city got light. The mediation was held at a firm on 8th Avenue SW. The room was everything those rooms always are. A long table, uncomfortable chairs, a jug of water nobody touches. Rachel came in with Clifton beside her and their lawyer behind them. Rachel looked tired. She didn't look at me for a long time. The mediator introduced herself, explained the process, asked everyone to remember that the goal was a negotiated resolution. Clifton's knee was bouncing under the table. I noticed that right away. His knee was bouncing and his jaw was set, and he had the particular expression of someone who believes they're about to end something. About 40 minutes in, their lawyer slid a folder across the table and said they wanted to table a settlement offer. $25,000, matching my specific bequest, and a small additional sum for what he called goodwill. He said the estate was clearly valid, that any challenge would be costly and ultimately unsuccessful, and that the most sensible outcome for everyone was for me to accept the offer and allow the probate to proceed without further delay. He used the phrase, "allow the probate to proceed," 3 times. Clifton leaned back in his chair. He had a small, tight smile that I recognized from 20 years of family dinners, the one he wore when he thought he'd already won. He said, "Sylvia, you've been out of the loop on the family finances for a long time. It's okay to not fully understand what you're dealing with here." My lawyer put her hand lightly on the table. She didn't say anything. She looked at me. I looked at Clifton. I said, "I'd like to respond to the offer." Their lawyer nodded. I said, "The December will was signed while my mother was on a combination of hydromorphone and lorazepam for pain and anxiety management. Her GP had documented concerns about her cognitive clarity in November. The 2 witnesses on the will have a direct personal relationship with Clifton, which we can establish. Helen McIntosh, who visited my mother 3 to 4 times per week in her final months, has provided a sworn statement that my mother expressed uncertainty about the changes she was being encouraged to make. We also have banking records that show 11 transfers totaling $62,000 from my mother's checking account to a joint account held by Rachel and Clifton in the 8 weeks before her death. The room went quiet, not the polite quiet of people waiting for someone to finish speaking. A different kind of quiet. Clifton's knee stopped bouncing. Those transfers, I said, may constitute an issue under the Wills and Succession Act and potentially under the Criminal Code, depending on how the Crown would like to characterize the pattern. We haven't made a report yet. We've been waiting to see how this conversation went. Rachel finally looked at me. Her face had changed. I had known my sister for her entire life, and I had never seen that particular expression on her. It was something between fear and grief and something else I couldn't name. "Sylvia," she said. Her voice was different, smaller. I said, "I don't want to destroy you, Rachel. I want what was already mine." Their lawyer asked for a brief recess. Clifton stood up very quickly and walked out of the room, and I watched him go and thought about how small a man looks when the thing he was leaning on disappears. My mother had wanted everyone to be happy. She'd asked Helen if that was wrong. The answer, I'd decided, was yes. Wanting everyone to be happy at the cost of what's right is exactly the wrong thing. And my mother, in her better years, would have known that too. We went back in after 20 minutes. The terms that came out of that room were these. The estate would be split in the manner of the 2019 will. The house would go to Rachel at current appraised value, with equalization payments to me structured over 18 months. The commercial property in Red Deer would be transferred into a jointly held family trust with equal distributions. The RRSP and TFSA funds, which had already been released to Rachel as named beneficiary, would be addressed through a private agreement, with Rachel paying back to the estate a sum equal to my proportionate share. The $62,000 in transfers would be repaid in full. The criminal code question was left unaddressed in the written agreement. Their lawyer made sure of that. I allowed it, because Rachel had looked at me in that room with that expression I couldn't name, and I understood that she had been in the middle of something she may not have fully chosen, and that Clifton's hands were on things she perhaps hadn't seen clearly. I am not certain of that. I don't know everything that happened in my mother's house in November and December, but I know what the documents show, and I know what Helen saw, and I know that Clifton had that tight little smile on his face when they walked in, and he didn't have it when they walked out. My flight back to Nanaimo was that evening. I sat at my gate at YYC with a coffee, a real one this time, hot, from one of the airport cafes, and I looked out at the tarmac and the planes moving slowly in the gray Alberta afternoon, and I thought about my mother. I thought about how she had worked hard her whole life and wanted her family to be okay. I thought about how she'd gotten confused at the end, maybe frightened, maybe pressured, maybe just tired. I thought about how she'd asked Helen if it was wrong to want everyone to be happy. I thought about the pearl earrings which I had in my carry-on in their original velvet box. She'd worn them to my university graduation. She'd worn them to Rachel's wedding. I put them on at the gate, just sat there in the plastic airport chair with my mother's pearl earrings on, drinking my coffee. Rachel texted me that night, just 2 words, "I'm sorry, I didn't respond right away." I thought about it for most of the flight, watching the lights of the Rockies disappear under the clouds, and then the darkness of the interior, and then the faint glitter of the lower mainland below. I thought about what sorry means and whether it's enough and whether it matters and whether a relationship can survive something like this, or whether surviving it is even the right goal. When we landed, I texted back, "I know. That was 6 months ago." Rachel and I have spoken 3 times since, brief, careful conversations. Clifton has not been part of any of them. The equalization payments have been arriving on schedule. The Red Deer property is generating income that comes to me quarterly, deposited into my holding company account like clockwork. I still have my mother's oil painting on the wall in my office. It's a small landscape. Nothing famous, just something she'd picked up at a craft fair in Canmore sometime in the 90s and loved for reasons she never fully explained. There's a path in it that goes into some trees and disappears. She used to say she liked wondering where it went. I think about that sometimes. I think about her sitting in her good chair looking at that painting, wondering where the path went, wanting everyone to be happy. I hope, wherever she is they are, I hope she knows I fought for what was hers to give me. Not because I needed the money, though the money is real and matters, but because she had already made that decision in 2019 with a clear mind and no one's hand on her shoulder, and I needed that decision to stand. That's what I went to Calgary for, not the house, not the RRSP, not the Red Deer property. I went for my mother's real wishes and I brought them home.